Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 17th Annual Moran Address. This event takes place each spring to honor Dr. William C. Moran, who served as the Vice President for Academic Affairs of Francis Marion College from 1978 to 1992, when he became the President of Lander University, a position that he held for 8 years. Dr. Moran's dedication to public service and higher education was recognized in 2000 when he was awarded the state's highest civilian honor, the Order of the Palmetto. Additionally, he was awarded the Governor's Award in the Humanities in 2008. This year's address will be presented by Dr. Beckie Flannagan, Professor Emeritus of English. Her talk this afternoon is titled, Narratives from Home, How a Kentucky Girl Moved to South Carolina and Started a Different Story. Beckie earned her BA and MA from Western Kentucky University and her PhD from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. She began her career at FMU in 1995 as a specialist in American literature. During her 29 years of service to the university, Beckie served in every faculty governance position, including chair of the faculty, served as chair of the English department, was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humanities degree in 2017, and was named Distinguished Professor in 2019. Even in retirement, Beckie continues to teach. Every Monday evening, she teaches her much-beloved true crime course. The class has a bit of a following, and the students call it Murder Mondays. I see many of those students are actually here with us today, as are many former students who have come from distances near and far to honor their former faculty member and friend. As President Carter states in his message in the program, Dr. Flannagan connects so well with students because their backgrounds closely mirror her own. And today we are going to learn more about that background as she provides us with a narrative from home. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Beckie Flannagan.
Thank you, Alyssa. How good it is to be here with you on this pretty spring afternoon for the 17th Annual Moran Lecture. I am really glad to see all of you. Some of you, like LaVon, I haven't seen it in probably not 20 years, 3 months. My thanks to the Faculty Life Committee who selects the Moran Lecturer each year, of course to the person who nominated me for this honor, and to Sean Miller who coordinates this event. I'd also like to thank the Moran family as well as Dr. Carter and Folly for hosting this annual tradition. I know, too, that there are many behind the scenes who bring these events together, and I see you, okay? I'd also particularly like to recognize Sandy Elder, the only person in this room who has known me since I was born, though technically I'm about 6 months older than her, and her 3 daughters, Reagan, Julie, and Jennifer, who traveled across the country to be here today. And for those of you who have known me for many years, but have never met my husband, today marks a rare Roy sighting. That's really the only mention of Roy, so applaud him a little bit. Picture this. I'm standing by a stove at dusk, looking out the kitchen window down a gravel road that leads to New Bethel Road, that leads to Highway 259, that leads to Hardinsburg, Kentucky, population about 2,200, a very small town about 10 miles south of the Ohio River in western Kentucky. I'm trying to cook supper on a Philco stove that only has one burner that works, so I've been at it for hours, hoping that the mashed potatoes and green beans stay warm while the chicken fries. The chicken is one of about 50 that I killed last summer and subsequently put into the deep freeze on the back porch for this fancy after-church meal. As I use a bent fork to turn the golden brown drumsticks, I can hear the dulcet sounds of a University of Kentucky basketball game turned up loud on the TV in the living room. If the pond freezes tonight, someone will have to get up at dawn to break ice for the Angus cows in the back pasture. If it stays warm, we'll start considering when we'll disc the ground for this year's tobacco crop. Weather is not far from anyone's mind. This was my mother's life, and the kind of life that she envisioned for me, living somewhere close to home with a skill set that would enable me to be useful to my family on the farm. I stepped off of that particular gravel road in order to find something else. These days, I cannot kill freeze, and then subsequently fry a chicken with any discernment, though my kitchen stove is in good repair and it's gas. No one that I know will have to chop through ice for any creature whose health and welfare are interwoven with bills that need to be paid. If it rains or snows, my own future and that of my family are not in danger, though I still cannot shake the need to know the weather despite current technology making it easier for me than paying attention to the direction of the wind or the way the high cirrus clouds, my dad called mare's tails, form in the late afternoon to signal a change in the weather. I do not think that I could have recognized the open road toward any future other than the one my mom and dad envisioned for me if I had not been a reader. And like most other readers, I cannot remember a time in my life when I was not actively engaged in the process. For the most part, my parents didn't have time to read, and I suspect that my mother probably couldn't read very well, but neither of my parents had more than an 8th grade education. I think technically my dad had 9th grade, but that's just 1 year. My mother also associated reading with idleness because of a lazy older sister. And so I soon developed my own habits for reading and imagining that by their very nature required solitude. Most of the time, I don't know why I ended up with this habit or became the person with the big ideas as my brother would good-naturedly, for the most part, rib me about. I never wanted for food or affection, but I cannot remember a time when I didn't want more. I can only imagine that reading opened up these possibilities for travel and experiences and ideas that were not readily apparent to me while I played at the edge of a cornfield or shelled peas in the backyard. My not being satisfied with the status quo was often seen as ungrateful and even spoiled. But ultimately, however, that inexplicable desire to do something different led me to a most fulfilling life of stoking that same desire in others. I didn't have shelves of books as my son did when he was young, and so every book I owned, I read and reread and annotated until it was falling apart, like my one pair of shoes or the slipcover on our ancient sofa. I checked out large stacks of books from the public library every week, choosing genres indiscriminately. A biography of Benjamin Franklin, an atlas of Antarctica, Agatha Christie's, and then there were none, The Scarlet Letter, or even The Great Gatsby, maybe the finest book in American literature. I read fast and immersively, often coming out of a book like coming out of a fugue state or a trance. I credit my precocious and reprobate reading schedule as the something that my early teachers felt needed nurturing. And I can truly say that if I had not been nurtured by my teachers, I am not sure my life could have been corralled into anything. I certainly wouldn't have been doing the Moran Address. Though I didn't read to impress anyone, my reading must have impressed a few teachers to see beyond what I presented at school. Farmer's daughter with uncombed hair, down-at-the-heel shoes, and hand-me-down clothes. Maybe it was Mrs. Walker in the 4th grade who encouraged me to debate penguins, bird or mammal. Maybe it was Mr. Arnold who suggested I try out for the academic challenge team, though I was closer to class clown than most intelligent in yearbook superlatives. My early teachers, many of them young and also the first in their families to go to college, noticed or valued something that I couldn't see. As a consequence, I believed what my teachers told me about my faults and my merits. Sure, I knew I was messy, loud, and prone to talking and talking some more, really to anyone and everyone at any time and all the time. But I was also someone who understood a complex book and beautifully dissected an earthworm. All of you in biology, I can do that maybe still. I was a handful, and the varying comments on my report cards reflect this. Some teachers were quick to remonstrate me for my inability to maintain any self-control and how that would always limit my potential. Others suggested that I would have a bright future. These prognostications were offered up like the cloudy answers in a magic 8-ball. Which answer would it be? As I see it, no, or signs point to yes. And most importantly, did I have any control over that outcome? My parents wanted my older brother to go to college, and he went kicking and screaming, but I had to plot my entry years in advance. In my high school class of about 150, only about 20 people each year went directly to university, usually, if not exclusively, a regional or state school. I was not even vaguely in the top 10% of my class academically, but I had performed well in my vocational agriculture classes, participated in regional and state Future Farmers of America contests, and thus had some backing from those ag teachers to pursue some sort of agriculture communications degree. And I talked a pretty big game, but I did not at all understand what I needed to do to get into college, which is typical, I now know, of first-generation students. The financial aid form was so confusing and not even close to digital in 1978. My parents did not like the idea of sharing our tax information. My guidance counselor encouraged me to take the ACT twice because of my truly abysmal math score, 9. For those of you who have taken the ACT, pretty dreadful. But I didn't really know how all those pieces went together. What was the connection between ACT scores and financial aid and tuition and accommodations and meal plans? If I got any kind of scholarship, what would that cover? Did I need to choose my roommate in advance? I can still remember getting my award letter and not quite understanding that Pell Grants were basically going to cover my educational cost as long as I didn't spend any of that money, which I invariably did, on anything other than food and books. Even then, shoes occupied my time a little bit. Pell Grant awardees had to live in the dormitory. I would never live off campus as an undergraduate. Meal plans were too expensive unless you were a student athlete, and I was not. Most dormitories had a small kitchen on every other floor where I was destined to prepare macaroni and cheese, instant coffee, and during this odd era before microwaves, coffee machines, and ramen noodles. I had never had health insurance or dental insurance, and so I could now go to the student health for free if I had a fever, though I didn't understand how it worked for free, so I didn't do it. When I stopped going to my freshman composition class during my first semester because my ex-boyfriend was in the class, I didn't want to ask anyone how to drop a class. I may not have even known that I could have dropped a class, so I ended up with an F. Not because I couldn't write or think, but because I didn't understand the system. I knew that my parents wouldn't care if I made an F, and that my 2.1 GPA for that first term was, in fact, not really a problem. I rather suspect that my mother might have been secretly glad that my experiment was not working. Somehow, those low expectations led me to try harder. I purposely added a class the next semester and then dropped it in order to learn how to do it. And then I quietly and unofficially switched majors to English and history. What changed? It might have been the chemistry requirement for the ag major, but I suspect it was the 2 lines written on my first history test that spring that helped. Dr. Marion Lucas was pleased with my A test and suggested that I would make an excellent history major. And so I thought so too. Sometime during my junior year, I started informally tutoring people in my dormitory study room, complete with a blackboard and chalk. I had recommended my favorite teacher to a girl on my floor, and she was failing her history class. So my tutoring, she said, enabled her to pass the class, and I felt guilty. "Why don't you teach?" she asked me. By the time I figured out how to switch my major to history and English education officially, I had over 160 hours of coursework in all sorts of esoteric subjects on my 5-year plan. But I was ready to teach. I really should have known that I was destined to teach because of how much I valued all the parts of the teacher-student interaction, even as a child. It really all goes back to some fortunate happenstances. One of the things that my daddy loved to do was attend estate sales on Saturday. Although my dad was almost comically reasonable, read stingy in most ways, he also had a lottery winner mindset about a lot of things. He was not one to squander even a nickel on anything, but he almost always believed that he could find something valuable in an estate sale that others couldn't find. During my childhood, he concentrated on collecting glassware, mostly old ball-perfect mason jars, pop bottles, or bitters bottles, some of them like 19th century, early 20th century glassware. Sometimes he and my brother would dig for bottles at the old city dump, and cities used there loosely because Hardinsburg was 2200. He usually acquired new items, however, at an estate sale, where years of the family's possessions would be offered up in cardboard boxes by an auctioneer with a patter to drive up the prices. I learned a lot about bottles from this experience. Amber glass is more valuable than green glass. I can't stop teaching. That bubbles in the glass itself meant the bottle was older, but most of my interest in the estate sale was consumed by the sheer volume of books that people owned and they were really ready to get rid of. As you might imagine, most of these books were not in any way interesting. I never found a bestseller, a children's book, or really even a novel. Most usually, I'd unearth decades-old textbooks or reference books on subjects like plant diseases or beginning accounting. Apologies to any business teachers here. One of the things my dad would do, perhaps vaguely unethically, was to visit the boxes of books pre-auction, stack them with select bottles he moved from other boxes. And then when the auctioneer would say, box of bottles and books, and start the bidding at 50 cents, Dad would bid wholeheartedly on that specific box for the specific bottles he wanted, usually getting the whole shebang for a steal at under $5, and I got all the books. Eventually, they would pile up in stacks in an upstairs attic room, and I started using them in one of my standard play-alone games, often during the summer when I was considered unhelpful at a farm task like chopping out weeds in the early garden. If you were unhelpful in my family, you didn't have to really do the serious tasks, like chopping out a garden. But anyway, I typically chose 6 or 8 textbooks on differing subjects, even math, and then wrote my name in cursive in the front of the book, as I was taught to do at the beginning of each school year. I would then scrounge around the house for scrap paper, a ruler, usually a lone Bic ballpoint pen, or a lead pencil sharpened by Dad with a paring knife, and put together my teacher's book for attendance and grading. I loved inventing exotic names for my imaginary students. I almost always had someone named Natasha, for example. Probably Rocky and Bullwinkle, but neither here nor there. I then set about designated different rooms in my parents' 1,000 square foot house for each subject area. Math in my bedroom, reading in the kitchen, health on the back porch. We had one old wind-up clock, and my mom would set the alarm to go off at 1-hour intervals so that my imaginary students could change out of their imaginary classes. I was the teacher who called the roll very seriously at the outset of each class, marked everyone either absent or present. I would prepare a modified lecture for each class, deliver it, assign homework for the next day. After classes, I worked on the homework, turned it in as if I was also an imaginary student. As the teacher, I'd grade my own work. Fortunately, many of the textbooks were either teacher's editions with the answers all in the back, or they had sample problems in the back where I could check things, particularly math. My mother despaired of the weeks that I played school because I invariably cluttered up every room in my house with books and papers, my teacher's record book, all of the homework that needed to be graded, all of the homework that needed to be turned in. In this scenario, I had an equal love for both teaching and learning, and this was where perhaps I started to link the two together. It was impossible not to learn while teaching and vice versa. And of all the things that happen in the classroom, the tools that one used to make the job fun, pens, rulers, pencils, notebooks, journals, file folders, lamps, they were all essential. Teachers and students need special tools, thus setting up my lifelong love for office supplies. I knew eventually what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing playing school. My path to an actual classroom and real students, though, was less clear to me. As I neared graduation, I didn't have anyone to help me launch into the job market. I didn't want to move out of Kentucky or even out of Western Kentucky. I didn't own a car or the wherewithal to even get to an interview that I'd somehow magically procured in Mississippi by randomly sending out applications to jobs at the Career Center sent me through snail mail. So I moved back home and started substitute teaching in my home county, Breckinridge County. A truly thankless but highly illuminating year of maintaining order in classes of very unruly children who were openly defiant of anyone who would deign to substitute teach. So a year without a real job, a real community, probably pushed me to pursue an assistantship in the English department at my alma mater. But my subject choice was determined by chance and availability. If there had been an availability in history, I would have applied for a program in history and I probably wouldn't be here today. At the time, I didn't know anyone other than my former college professors who had an advanced degree in anything. It never occurred to me that anyone other than a genius would even consider anything beyond a bachelor's degree. But I was rather desperate and bored and a little irritable living at home. The assistantship would pay a whopping $300 per month, but tuition and fees were covered, and I could live in the dorm as I would need to because I couldn't afford the down payment on a vehicle or an apartment. I got a second job at a Cracker Barrel, took out the first of many student loans, and hoped for the best. No disrespect to anyone in the room, but as it turned out, I didn't need to be a genius to get an advanced degree. I know you're all surprised to know that. Those of you that have PhDs, right? And teaching as a graduate student confirmed several things that I needed to know. One, I really like teaching college students, particularly those who might need a little encouragement. Two, the world of academia contained themes of all the things that I really loved in this world: books, reading, discussion, thinking, writing, and a sense of purpose and community. And that world was learnable. I studied how to be an academic as one might study the flora and fauna of an unusual geographic region. I watched how people dressed, what they talked about, the kind of music they listened to, the way meetings were held. I started joining things and volunteering to get closer to the academic action. I imitated my professors, tried to make myself indispensable. I took over classes for others. I learned how to teach composition using computers. That seems weird, but at the time it was really remarkable. I reviewed textbooks. I led study groups. I held office hours. I counseled students in everything, including grammar. And by this point, I had navigated a few things about being a college student. But learning the academic system by observation and immersion as a graduate student helped me reflect more on why it was so hard to be a first-generation college student. So many of the systems are hidden from students, tucked away in offices with titles on a closed door, people wearing suits who were the gatekeepers. Even though I was a talker and an extrovert since really birth, I always had a sense that I was an interloper, as psychologists would call it, an imposter. I knew that most students, even those that seemed the hardest to teach, plagiarists, class cutters, binge drinkers, were likely enacting some version of my younger self. They just needed to ask the right person the right questions, and earlier rather than later. When I was asked to interview for the temporary instructor of composition at FMU, I had not a clue about what that entailed. I only believed that if I could get a face-to-face interview, I might be able to talk myself into a job by sheer willpower. I knew that I had an advantage because I actually liked teaching composition. I figured that probably half or more of the applicants for this job would consider it slumming to care about teaching a basic class. So this was my ace in the hole. I didn't prepare for this interview in any way that one might prepare in today's job market. And to be honest, I can't remember any of the questions at my preliminary interview at the Four Cs Conference in Washington, D.C. Later, a hiring committee member told me that I'd solidified my on-campus interview by the manner in which I told, quote unquote, charming and memorable anecdotes during my brief chat. Almost immediately after arriving at FMU, I felt like I had joined a special club. I interviewed on campus in April when the azaleas bloomed, and I must have done most things right to get the offer a day later. I held a temporary line for 3 years before applying for a tenure line position. As I had done in graduate school, I made it a point to join. I volunteered to help develop an assessment for our freshman composition program, a thankless task if there ever was one. I helped at the Writing Center. I worked with Snell and Review. I immersed myself in teaching and FMU's unique student profile. I learned pretty quickly that a large share of FMU undergraduates were also starting out somewhat clueless, trying to engage with a system that they might not totally understand. This is not to say that FMU students lacked intelligence or ambition or even direction. But many of my classes, in my earlier years, particularly at FMU, when I had more first-generation students, they made the same mistakes, sometimes alarmingly exaggerated versions of my mistakes. I was, in effect, surrounded by different versions of my former first-generation self. My composition teaching morphed as a result. For the first time, I started opening my freshman composition classes by telling everyone that I had failed this very class when I was 18. As I revealed this dark, hidden truth that sometimes felt akin to admitting to a crime, not murder exactly, but I often noticed a change in the tenor of the class. I would end my confession by telling my class there was no question that was too stupid or embarrassing if it would save them from failing a class or losing their financial aid or getting help understanding how things worked. Sometimes students would ask these questions directly in class, but often I would hear about their concerns during office hours. Water break. I also started writing papers alongside those that my students wrote, many of them touching on anecdotes about my life on the farm and my peripatetic path to academia. There's the story about how my brother told me that a rat was a kitten, and I picked it up and it bit me. There's the story about lifting up the lid of a bubbling pot in the kitchen and finding a hog's head staring at me. There's the one about how I never invited any of my friends to my house because I was too ashamed that we didn't have a bathroom. Sandy would come. She was the only one that visited me. There was no story really that was too embarrassing to relay. And I realized that the more I revealed myself to my students, the more they trusted me. And the more they trusted me, the more likely they would be to ask me questions and get directions to the counseling center or the writing center or the courage to ask someone for help on a physics assignment or how to drop a class that they were failing. I've been lucky to teach alongside some really exceptional faculty here at FMU, some of them, like our own president, Fred Carter, first-generation college students themselves. And this atmosphere helped make a lot of this magic happen. I taught all my classes infused with stories that in effect said this: it doesn't matter where you come from to get to a place that you want to be. About 2 years before I retired, a former student sent me an email to tell me that she was starting a PhD program in biology. The name on the from line was unfamiliar, so I had to read a bit into the email before I realized why she was writing. In this email, this student thanked me for inspiring her when I taught her in freshman composition. I couldn't imagine what I had said in my required writing class that prompted her to get a PhD in biology, but she quickly illuminated that. She said I was unlikely to remember her at all because she was quiet and did not excel in any way in my class. Fortunately, I have all my grade books since I started at FMU, paper grade books, as only a person who once played school would. And so I looked through all of them until I found her name. She had made a C, and I didn't have a vapor of a vision of who she was. I was more confused as to how I could have helped her in any way. But she then said that at the beginning of the semester, I had talked about how I had gone to college and graduated with advanced degrees, not despite not having financial or intellectual support from my parents, and that story had stuck with her enough to keep her persevering toward her own goals. A PhD in biology. Who would do that? Tim Shannon. I have always measured any success I may have had in the classroom by my students' accomplishments and successes. I'm so happy to see so many former students here today. I've been lucky to have stayed in touch with so many students, some from the first class I taught at FMU in 1995. Many of my students have become dear friends. Some call me mother. But I think this correspondence with a former student, a student I really didn't even remember, helped me recall how important the classroom and teachers can be. In this instance, I had tangible proof that I'd really closed the gap that I'd wanted to close between teacher and student. She heard something that I most wanted students to hear, but heard it so quietly that I didn't even notice it. And that's okay. Teaching and learning is filled with millions of these little moments. And it was a great comfort to know that even when I didn't know that anyone was listening, someone was. I didn't think I was going to cry. Sorry. My narratives from home have always kept me grounded because I know that if it weren't for a well-placed teacher or a point of encouragement or a good friend or the right book on the right shelf, I would have had a very different life. I often wish I could write every teacher who ever said they expected me to have a bright future to tell them they were right. Thank you.
Dr. Rebecca Flannagan,
Yes.
Dr. Sharon O'Kelly. Yes.
on behalf of Francis Marion University, the administration, and the faculty, I would like to present you with this gift for your years of service and inspiration to this university and this community. Thank you so much.
Does it have an alarm? Can I play school with it?
I don't know.
Thank you all very much. Please join us for a reception outside and listen to my playlist.
And there's a copy of the speech outside as well, this incredible speech. Thank you all.
Oh yeah, there are some artifacts. Yes, did you say that? Thank you all very much.